More on the strategic aspect of the conflict in Ukraine, let's bring in Emeritus Professor Paul Dibb from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU. Let's just start on what we've seen there, because so much of this war has been really hard to follow, you know, sort of conflicting sometimes Twitter images and people's takes, but that I think really summed up the brutality of Russian troops, a civilian walking around with their bike in the streets and just being fired on like that.
Yes, indeed. And we should expect that much of the Russian population has been brutalized by the rule of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin for the last 22 years. And you've got to remember that, unlike here, they don't receive any other television news. It is Russia Today, which is the state-run TV station, independent voices such as the famous radio station Echo Moskvy, which I spoke live to on radio 5 years ago in Moscow. That's been closed. Novaya Gazeta, the new newspaper, which also had liberal views, has been closed down. So 70% of Russians are in favor of this war. And you've got to remember, this is not the educated elite class. It's the people living out in the suburbs or out in Siberia, older people, and they believe all the propaganda that they've been fed with. And that then what the troops do, in Russian troops in Ukraine.
Yeah, and of course we know that's often divided on age groups, so younger Russians that get their news sources elsewhere, not surprising, have a bit of a different view. What about what we're seeing right now? Is this a definitive shift from Russia? They're focused now on the Donbass region. I guess it can allude to two things. One, that they are lowering their ambitions because this task suddenly seems too difficult, or just concentrating its forces, rolling through Donbass and then perhaps still going back to the west.
Look, we don't know. Most experts, including the United States chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior military person in Washington, before this invasion, at a closed session of the Congress, apparently told the Congress the Russian troops would be in Kiev in 72 hours. And I must say, my view is, yeah, that's probably right. And secondly, we've underrated the fighting capabilities of the Ukrainians. We've mightily underrated them, and so have the Russians. Putin is being fed propaganda and disinformation by his own intelligence people. He sacked his chief of foreign intelligence and the deputy chief of the 5th Directorate of Foreign Intelligence, presumably because they told him, we will be welcomed in arms as Russian liberators from this Nazi militarized society. Well, how wrong has he got that? Seriously, badly wrong.
The question has been, and again, there's such a disparate view on this, the extent to which this task might be too difficult for Russia to have some sort of takeover of all of Ukraine, particularly given as what you were talking about there, the willingness to fight from Ukrainians and the fact that that could well extend beyond any sort of takeover, that even if you capture the country, you're fighting this forever war. Do you think that Ukraine in that sense could actually win the war, for want of a better description, if they get enough weapons?
For Ukraine to win, the definition of that is that Putin, the Tsar of all the Russias, the dictator, if you like, would have to admit losing. And believe you me, he is not going to do that. He's not going to climb down, because to climb down from his insistence, if you remember, that he wants a guaranteed international treaty signed by America and the European members of NATO, that NATO will never, ever allow Ukraine to be a member of NATO. And he's put his reputation on the line. And secondly, he wants official recognition from the Ukrainians that Russia owns the Crimea, the Donbass, that's Donetsk and Lugansk, and whatever else he's conquered. Now, look, you know, if he's logical, you might expect him, if this war drags on, and I see the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, is talking that this may go on for years. You would think if Putin was a logical thinker, he might quit. He's not going to do that, unless I'm badly wrong, by the way.
No, I think it's a fair bet. You get to the possibility of regime change, no inkling of that. And then perhaps I guess it comes down to maybe framing in terms of win and loss, but I understand exactly what you're saying. Really appreciate your time there, Paul Dibb. Thank you.
My pleasure.